Good morning, students. In the last class, we were seeing the Dear Departed Part 1 of the Unit 2. So, we have completed half part of the story and we have to complete the remaining part of that. So, yes, in the last class, we have seen till where Mrs. Jordan and Ben as arrived, means they went to Mrs. Slater's house and they were uh, consoling Slater for the death of their father, and they were asking the clear description, means what has happened in that situation. So Mrs. Slater was explaining that their father went out to pay the insurance, and later he was lying in the bed, and when they had completed their dinner she thought to take some food for him, and when she went in his room still he was lying. So she thought she would wake him up, and she kept the tray on that bureau, and when she saw that person, means her father was died. So she was explaining this situation, and she was asking Mrs. Jordan and Ben whether whether they will take tea or will they go and once have a look of their father's body. So till here we have completed the lesson. Today we will be continuing the remaining part of the lesson. Mrs. Jordan, what do you say, Ben? Then Mrs. Jordan was asking Ben, what do you say? Then Ben said, I'm not particular. So Mrs. Jordan, she surveying the table, she said, well then, if the kettle's ready, we may as well have tea first. So then Ben was not sure, means whether he want to take tea or he want to go and see their father. He is not sure. So Mrs. Jordan, observing the table, she said that if the kettle is ready, we may uh, as well have tea first. So she said, first we will take tea, then we will go and see the father. Then Mrs. Slater puts the kettle on the fire and gets tea ready. By the time Henry, what he will say, one thing we may as well decide now is the announcement in the papers. So Henry will be saying that we will decide one thing, that we should means we should uh, give an announcement in the papers. Then Mrs. Jordan said, I was thinking of that, what would you put? So she was saying that I am also thinking of that, but what we will announce. So there was a pause, and then Mrs. Jordan said, what did she say? Well, uh, we will think about it after tea, and then we will look through his bits of things and make a list of them. There's all the furniture in his room. So Mrs. Jordan said that, well, we will think about it after taking tea, means after having tea, and then we will look through his bits, means we will means she is saying that we will look through his bits of things and make a list of them. So she's saying that what all the things or the properties left from their father, she said that we will look after that and we will make a list of them. There's all the furniture in his room. So she's saying that there is all the furniture in his room. Then Henry said, there's no jewelry or valuables of that sort. Then Henry was saying that there's no jewelry or valuables of that sort, means they want to make a list, isn't it? So he was saying that there are no that much important things which has to be mentioned in the list. Then Mrs. Jordan said that except his gold watch, he promised that to our Jimmy. So she was saying that except his gold means whose her father's gold watch, he promised that to our Jimmy. So Mrs. Slater, what she was saying, promised your Jimmy? I never heard of that. So by listening to Mrs. Jordan's words, Mrs. Slater said, means a little awkwardly she was saying that promise your Jimmy, means she is in a, means she was saying in an awkward way, saying that promise your Jimmy, I never heard of that. So she was saying that I didn't heard about it. Then Mrs. Jordan said, oh, but he did. Emilia, when he was living with us, he was very fond of Jimmy. So Mrs. Jordan was uh, explaining that when he was living with Mrs. Jordan, he was very fond of Jimmy and he promised to give his gold watch to Jimmy. Then Mrs. Slater, well, I don't know, means in an amazing way she is saying that, well, but I don't know. Then Ben, anyhow, there's his insurance money. Have you got the receipt for the premium he paid this morning? So, by listening the argument of Mrs. Jordan and Mrs. Slater, Ben said, anyhow, there is his insurance money. And he was asking about the receipt of the insurance premium which he had paid in the morning. And Mrs. Slater, I have not seen it. Then Mrs. Slater was saying that no, I haven't seen that receipt. Victoria jumps up from the sofa and comes behind the table. By the time Victoria jumps up from the sofa and she comes behind the table, and Victoria will be saying, Mother, I don't think Grandpa went to pay his insurance this morning. So Victoria was telling to her mother that she won't think that their grandfather had went to pay his insurance this morning. Mrs. Slater, she was saying he went out. Then Victoria was saying, yes, but he didn't go into the town. He met old Mr. Tattersall down the street, and they went off past St. Philip's Church. Then when Mrs. Slater said he went out, Victoria was explaining that yes, he went out, but he didn't went into the town. He met old Mr. Tattersall's down the street, means she was telling that she met a old Mr. Tattersall in the street, and they both went off past St. Philip's Church. Then Ben, do you think he hasn't paid it? Was it overdue? Then Ben was asking that do you think that he haven't paid that, or was it overdue? So Mrs. Slater is saying that I should think it was overdue. So Mrs. Slater is explaining that I think his insurance premium may be overdue. Then Mrs. Jordan says, something tells me he's not paid it. So she is saying that I feel, means something, a feeling that I can feel that he has not paid that insurance amount. Then Ben, the drunken old beggar. Then Ben is saying that the drunken old beggar in Mrs. Jordan, he's done it on purpose just to annoy us. Then when Ben was saying that old man as the drunken old beggar, Mrs. Jordan was saying he's done it, or means he has done it purposely, means wantedly, just to annoy us. And Mrs. Slater says, after all I have done for him, having to put up with him in the house these 3 years, it's nothing short of swindling. So she is saying that Mrs. Slater is telling that after all I have done for him, means she is telling that I have done so much for him, but having to put up with him in the house means that old person, their father was living for 3 years along with them. So she is saying that I have done all things for him, but it is not easy to uh, put him means it is not easy for them to look after him for the 3 years in that house. And she is telling that it's nothing short of swindling means cheating somebody for property or money. Then Mrs. Jordan say that I had to put up with him for 5 years. Then she is explaining, Mrs. Jordan is explaining that I means as later is telling that I have look after him for 3 years. Then Mrs. Jordan is saying that I have look after for 5 years. I have look after him for 5 years. Then Mrs. Slater say that, and you were trying to turn him over to us all the time. Then she is telling that though he was living with you for 5 years, you were trying to make him against us all the time. Means she is Mrs. Slater is telling to Jordan that you have made our father against us. Then by listening the conversation of both of them, Henry was saying that, but we don't know for certain that he is not paid the premium. Then Henry is saying that, but we don't know that he had not paid the premium. Then Mrs. Slater, uh, Victoria, run upstairs and fetch that bunch of keys that's on your grandpa's dressing table. Then Mrs. Slater was shouting on Victoria, saying that and fetch run upstairs and fetch that bunch of keys that's on your grandpa's dressing table. So she is telling to Victoria to run upstairs and fetch means bring that bunch of keys which is on the grandpa's dressing table. Then Victoria timidly in grandpa's room. Then she went into grandpa's room. Then Mrs. Slater, yes, Victoria, I I don't like to. Then Victoria is telling that I don't like to. Then Mrs. Slater, don't talk so silly. There's no one who can hurt you. Then Mrs. Slater was means scolding Victoria as she was afraid to go into that room. So Mrs. Slater is saying that don't talk so silly and there is no one to hurt you. Victoria goes out reluctantly. We will see if he's locked the receipt in the bureau. Then as Victoria don't want to go into the grandpa's room, when her mother scolded her, she went out reluctantly, and and she was telling that we will see if he is locked the receipt in his bureau. Ben, in where? In this thing? He raises and examines it. So when Mrs. Slater said that we will observe means we will look in his bureau, then Ben was questioning in where and in this thing, and he rises and examines the bureau because they have put the bureau in the downstairs and they have kept that old drawers table in the grandpa's room, isn't it? So in confusion she said that bureau. So when listening the word bureau, Ben was questioning that in this thing, and he was observing that bureau. Then Mrs. Jordan also rising Where did you pick that up? Amelia, it's new since last I was here. So Mrs. Jordan also went near the bureau, and she was also looking at that bureau, and she was asking Amelia that where did you pick that up? And it's new since last I was here. So she was telling that when I came last time to your house, I didn't saw this, and from where you have brought this one. So she is questioning like that to Mrs. Slater, and they examined it closely. Then Mrs. Slater, oh, Henry picked it up one day. So she is telling that, oh, Henry picked it up one day. And Victoria returns very scared, and she closes the door after her. Victoria, mother, Victoria was shouting, mother, mother. And then Mrs. Slater, what is it, child? Then Mrs. Slater was questioning when Victoria was shouting, mother, mother. Then Mrs. Slater was questioning, what is it, child? Means what happened? Then Victoria was telling that grandpa's getting up. Then Victoria was telling that grandfather is getting up. Ben was saying, what? Then Mrs. Slater was telling, what do you see? Then, when Victoria was saying that grandfather is getting up, then Ben and Mrs. Slater was questioning, what do you say? Then Victoria repeats again, grandpa's getting up. Then Mrs. Jordan says that the child's crazy. Then when Victoria was saying that grandfather is getting up, Mrs. Jordan was saying that this child is crazy. Then Mrs. Slater says, don't talk so silly. Don't you know your grandpa's dead? Then Mrs. Slater was telling to Victoria that don't talk silly, and you know that your grandfather is dead. Then Victoria was telling, no, no, he's getting up. I saw him. Then Victoria was telling to her mother that no, means he's not dead. I saw him getting up. So they are transfixed with amazement. Victoria clings to Mrs. Slater. Ben suddenly hissed, listen. Then Victoria was very much afraid, and she went near Mrs. Slater, means to her mother. And even Ben also suddenly hissed and listen, he was telling. So they look at the door. A slight chuckling is heard from upstairs. The door opens, revealing an old man clad in a faded but gay dressing gown. He is in his stockinged feet, although over 70. He is vigorous and well colored. His bright, malicious eyes twinkle under his heavy, reddish grey eyebrows. He is obviously either the old man, Abel Merriweather, or else his ghost. So, when Victoria was telling that that her grandfather is not dead, and when she saw him getting up, no one was believing. Means they are telling that she is Victoria is little bit crazy, and she is talking. They were thinking that she is talking so silly, but later Ben also heard the sound from the upstairs, and when they look at the door, a slight chuckling, a slight chuckling is heard. Chuckling means laughing quietly out of mild amusement or satisfaction. And means they heard some sound from the upstairs, and the door opens, revealing an old man clad means wearing a particular type of clothing in a but faded but gay dressing gown, and he is in stockinged feet, Although over 70, he is vigorous and well colored. His bright, malicious eyes means harmful eyes twinkle under his heavy reddish grey eyebrows. He is obviously either the old man Abel Merriweather or else his ghost. So when they heard the sound from upstairs, they were looking at the door, and then the door opens, revealing an old man. He is wearing a particular type of dress uh, with a gay dressing gown, and he is in his uh, stock-length feet. And although over 70 means he is over 70 years, but he is vigorous and well colored, and his bright and dangerous means harmful eyes twinkle under his heavy reddish gray eyebrows, and he is obviously, so they can see him wearing a gown, and they can see him standing uh, firmly, and they can observe his bright harmful eyes under his dark reddish gray eyebrows, and they are thinking that uh, it may be the old man Abel Merriweather, or maybe his ghost. So the remaining part here they have given, see, continued in B reading. So we will see what has happened in the B reading. So till here we have completed A reading. Then we will see the remaining part of the story in B reading. Okay students, we will continue the remaining part of the lesson in the next session. Thank you. Have a good day.